Welcome everyone. Thanks for still watching these. If you are, I hope that you are, but I do see the numbers, so um, seems to go down as the semester goes on. But I understand that online is not super fun, so I am sympathetic to that. But glad you're here. If you're watching, um, I should let you know I'm working on the papers. Um, It's taking longer than I had anticipated because I'm trying to give feedback so that you can do better on your next paper. Um, so yeah, it's taking a lot longer than I thought it would, but I am actively working on it, and I'm just grading as I go. So some of you may already have your grades and stuff. So be grateful if that's you. And let's see. What else should I say? I guess I should talk about for next paper maybe things to avoid or things to keep in mind that I'm seeing. So, one thing that I'm seeing is just kind of a lack of formality. So, it's fine, like I've said, in your critical summaries to say things like, I like this because, or this made sense to me because, or stuff like that. But in your paper, that's like a formal paper. So instead of saying something like, I did agree with this point, you should say, this argument is compelling because, and then you could explain why or why not. You like it, but not say that you like it. Say like, it's compelling, it's convincing, it's just words that aren't, it shouldn't read like a Facebook post or something. And I don't mean that in a condescending way. I just mean like, it's easy to talk, like if you're presenting your opinion, it's easy to get caught up in personal language because it probably means something to you. So it's easier to write like you would be talking, but you don't really want to do that because, like, if you read a transcript of the way that I talk, it would not make much sense. Because I'm asking questions, I'm like, you know what I mean? Or stuff like that. Like, you don't want to say stuff like that. So keep that in mind for your next papers. And then another thing is, for me, the easiest way to write a paper is to have like, is to do like an outline like I showed you guys. So that means being really clear about each point in your outline. So your thesis should be in the first paragraph. It should be clear. You should be saying, I am arguing this. I shouldn't have to like try and decipher what your thesis is. And you should say in your first paragraph why you're arguing that. Just a short, obviously the rest of your paper is why you're arguing that. But just a brief, like, this is what it's gonna be like. You don't need an interesting introduction. Like, you don't need like in English class, maybe they taught you to have like an attention getter. No need for that. So you don't need to say like, for centuries, humans have questioned the existence of God or something like that. Just dive right into your argument. Or your introduction about what you're going to be arguing about. Clarity and being concise are the most, and okay, so thoroughly concise is very important. So that means if you bring up a point, you need to explain that point well, thoroughly, but not to where you get off track and to where it gets confusing. So you want to stay on task, on topic, and say what you're trying to say, and then be done with it. Because it is a short paper, so you can't go into like full detail, but you can go into a good amount of detail, especially because You're not going to have too many points to bring up. So if you treat each point that you bring up thoroughly, then you're good to go. I like to start my papers introduction and then an explanation of whatever argument I'm arguing against or in favor of. So give ample time in your paper to present the philosopher's opinion that you're going to be agreeing with or disagreeing with. This is where, like, it's a summary of what they're saying, but it should be thorough, because you're supposed to be writing as though your reader, me, hasn't read the passage. So make it clear and concise and thorough. I do try to... Oh, also, this is something that I keep saying, and it's very important. So let me explain how I grade. So a lot of my grading has to do more with you following directions than it does with how good of a philosophical writer you are. Because I understand this is an intro class, so not everybody's going to be familiar with this type of writing. And I mean, it's not everybody's thing. Like, taking algebra or biology, not my thing. But I tried to do my assignments, get everything done, and it was fine. So that's what I want to be the case for everyone, that if you do the assignments, you read the directions well, thoroughly, and you do what is asked of you, that you will do fine. That's the goal of my course, because I want you to be learning stuff, but I don't want you to get docked for not understanding stuff that's hard. If you are having just trouble with the lectures, understanding stuff like that, then please reach out to me, because I do want you to understand. And if I've said something, multiple times and tried to be as clear as possible, and maybe your paper demonstrates that you misunderstood, then, that could be a reason for deduction of points. But what I'm trying to say is that primarily my grading is based on, did you do what you were asked? And then, so that determines whether you have an A, B, C, D, whatever. And then, like, the points in between, like the difference between an 87 and an 83 might be, like, did you make a compelling case type of thing. So directions are so important. So important. So there is a page requirement for everything that you write. So in your critical summaries, if you don't write at least a full page, then you'll get like an 80 or a 75 immediately before I read it. Because that just demonstrates that you're not doing what was asked of you. Same thing for papers. 4 to 6 pages means 4 full pages. So if you just get one sentence at the top of page 4, that is 3 pages and a sentence. That's not 4 pages. So for the next paper, 6 to 8 pages, it should be 6 full pages. So if you don't meet the page requirement, it's automatically a deduction of 10 points, because that's just not reading directions. And then having a clear thesis is another thing that can make you lose a decent amount of points. And yeah, I hope that my grading makes sense, because I want you to be graded on what I'm asking you to do. So if you do what I ask, you do great. So reading directions thoroughly is always my recommendation. Yeah. So anyways, point is, I'm working on them, and I'm trying. So all right, shifting gears now. If you do have questions about anything in the class, please reach out to me. We just have a couple months left. Whoa, so next month is November, and then December, and we're done. It's crazy. Okay, anyways, so moving on. We are moving on to the topic of free will. So instead of having you read a section from the book, I chose 2 readings for y'all. Mostly because, like, I'm familiar with what I gave you, and I think that it's interesting. So I just kind of did that instead of the book. But the intro in the book about free will, introducing the topic, is really helpful if you wanted to look at that. Yeah, so free will. This is an interesting topic because a lot of you used free will in your papers to talk about why evil exists or why the problem of suffering is a thing. Also, this is a huge thing of water, so don't judge me, but it's just what I have with me, so. Anyways, so yeah, a lot of people use free will as in your papers, and whenever we talk about Augustine, I think it'll be really helpful just in thinking about what you argued for, because there are some holes that you can fall into when making a free will argument. So in general, just the topic of free will is really important to understanding humanity, because if somebody commits a crime, or let's just say commits a crime, robs someone, do we think that that person is morally responsible for what they did? Pretty much everyone, I mean not everyone, but almost everyone, would say yes, that person should be held responsible for what they did. So what makes humans responsible for their wrongdoings and animals not responsible for their wrongdoings? Because you may say, like, if your dog pees on the carpet, that happens a lot to me. Immediately I want to be like, that is, like, I want to put the moral blame on the dog and be like, this was entirely your fault. You thought this through, this was premeditated. But whenever I come to my senses, I'm a little less angry. It's just the dog. Like, that's the only type of punishment that they'll get is just, I mean, they will get punished, but they won't get punished in the same way a human would get punished. For a human, there's this moral component, and you need to explain or talk about, or at least have thought about, why this person is getting the punishment that they're getting and how they can do better. For a dog, it's kind of just like, over time, my dog will realize that if he pees on the carpet, then he's going to get a spanking, and then he's going to have to go in the kennel for a while. So that's more of like developing just like muscle memory of like, oh, I do this. If I do this, then I get punished. For humans, there's like a thinking component of, this was actually a wrong thing to do. Animals don't have the concept of right and wrong. Typically, you might think that they do. And that's fine, but most of the time we kind of assume that they don't. So it's important to note or to understand what makes humans morally responsible. And we most of the time think that they are morally responsible because if somebody robs you, we typically think of them as having the capacity to have not robbed you. So they had the chance and the opportunity to choose not to do that, but they did it anyways. So that capacity for choosing would be what free will is. So that's just kind of a basic understanding of free will. I literally don't know why I get so out of breath when I do this. Sorry. I think it's because normally if I'm talking to somebody, you ask them a question, they talk for a minute, then you talk for a minute. But with this, it is just me. So forgive me if I keep saying it's mostly because I'm trying to catch my breath, which is humiliating. But it is what it is. So you can also have the opinion that free will doesn't exist. So, one reason that most people assume that free will exists is because of your experience. So, I have the thought right now of I could either pick up this book next to me or I could not. So, right now, I'm choosing not to, it seems. It doesn't seem like anybody is in the room is making me or forcing me to not pick the book up. And now I am picking the book up. So, and it really doesn't seem that anybody forced my hand in that. It seemed that I did all of that. So, just by experience, it seems that humans have free will because we consciously think about our decisions and then make choices. But that might not be a good reason to believe something. Because the experience of conscious choice might not show that there is a conscious choice. It might show that we are not normally aware of factors that determine our choices. So there could be someone controlling my brain right now that is making me think, I should pick up that book now, and then I pick it up. Or it could just be me, either way. So if someone is controlling my brain right now, then that would not be free will. That would be someone else controlling me. And some people might make the argument that the person that is controlling my thoughts is God. Because if God is truly omnipotent and omniscient, then God has the power and the power to make me do whatever, and has the knowledge that I will be doing whatever. So say some people make the argument that God has divine foreknowledge, meaning that since he knows everything, he knows in 10 years what I'm going to be doing. In 10 years at 8:41, October 26th, he knows exactly what I'll be doing. Since he knows that, and since he's not changing anything about it, he's not doing anything about it, does that make God responsible for my actions at that point? So if in 10 years, October 26th, 8:42 p.m., I decide to rob someone. I don't see that in my future, but you never know. And God knows that that's going to happen. If he doesn't stop me, he has the power to do so, would that make him morally responsible for my actions since he is allowing it to happen? That's an important question for theists, if they believe in an omniscient, omnipotent God. And that was something in some papers that if God doesn't see everything that's about to happen, or doesn't know, or isn't in control of everything that's about to happen, then he wouldn't be morally responsible. But would he still be God then, if he doesn't have his ability to control everything that happens? Because you end up having to say that God can't do something. But in most traditional theistic understandings of God, he can do all things. So it's kind of a conundrum that you might find yourself in. Then you have physical determinism or physical indeterminism. Determinism just meaning that everything is determined in advance. So that would be, if it's a physical determinism, then the laws of nature determine everything that's going to happen. So some can argue that because the laws of nature are in the way that they are, everything that occurs has already been decided and you can't do anything about it. So every decision I make has already been programmed into the world. So that kind of takes away human moral responsibility. So when someone murders someone, they're just doing what the universe kind of had planned for them to do. Now, most people won't go so far as to say that, but you can still maintain determinism and not say that. But you do have to, that's another conundrum that you kind of have to explain why that's the case. So, yeah, those are kind of the main basic understandings. For next lecture, we'll talk about a non-religious understanding. And today we'll talk about a religious understanding. So, if you were able to read, which I hope you were, Augustine's Reconsiderations, he kind of addresses the problem of divine foreknowledge without explicitly stating it. He's dealing with a bunch of different issues of faith and trying to explain them. So, oh gosh, I didn't look this up. Let me see when Augustine was born. I know the roundabouts time, but I forget the dates. All right. So, Augustine. I've talked about him, but this is our first time reading him. He was a North African guy, philosopher, theologian. He was the bishop of Hippo Regius in North Africa. So he's also known as Saint Augustine, so well regarded in the Christian Church, Catholic and Protestant. He was born in 354 and died in 430. So he was around at the very beginning of the church. I guess this is 350 years after Jesus was here. So, but this still, we consider this to be early church history. Near the beginning, them figuring stuff out after Jesus ascends. So he is one of the fathers of the Christian faith. And he touches on a lot of things. He's also, not only is he a famous theologian, but we read him in philosophy because he was a major philosopher of the time. He was Platonic in some sense, so followed after Plato in some ways, but also tried to really separate from that philosophical position as he got older. So he grew up with his mom being a Christian, but he got involved with a group called the Manichaeans. And if you have read this, you'll see that he is arguing against the Manichaeans. So the Manichaeans believed a bunch of different stuff. A lot of it was Platonic. So thinking that so one thing that characterized Manichaeanism was they always thought that there was this battle between good and evil, always warring against each other. And Augustine ends up rejecting this whenever he becomes a Christian because basically evil is not near as powerful as good. Even though on earth, for Christians, there's an understanding of there being good and evil at war, there's no cosmic battle because Jesus has already won that. So for the Manichaeans, Satan would have much more power because he actually puts up a fight against God. But the Christian would say that while God does have a battle, he ultimately defeats him, no problem. So yeah, that's one difference. And the Manichaeans also, just fun facts about them, they viewed the material world as completely evil and the spiritual world as awesome, which is very Platonic. Plato saw the material world as something to be escaped from. So he valued wisdom and thought, because the more you think, the more you become one with the forms, which are like the perfect nature of everything, the more you leave the material world. So material world was bad. As Augustine left Manichaeanism and became a Christian, he started rejecting more of that because Christians view the creation as good, fallen, but good. And that whatever God creates, he calls good. So he is. I chose this, so I could have chosen a few different writings from Augustine, but I chose this one because it kind of sums everything up. He talks about what he says in response to Manichaeanism, and he also talks about what he says in response to Pelagianism. So for Augustine, on one side, talking about free will, you have, hold on, yeah, I think I can fit it. You have complete autonomy. I'll explain in a sec. On the other side, you have no autonomy. So autonomy kind of means the same thing as will. So on one side of the spectrum, you have complete autonomy, meaning humans have ultimate control. So the reason everything is bad in the world is because humans sin and they do bad things, and God can't fix it, so humans have ultimate control. God is not going to intervene. He can't in this view. So that's why things suck. On this other side, you have no autonomy, meaning that humans have no moral responsibility because they're not in control of everything or anything at all, because God is in control. So, none of those sound like great options. So, Augustine kind of lands in the middle, which is where most of Christian church history has landed. Right in the middle. So, this is what is called, I didn't have my rag today, so. Oh, I shouldn't have erased this part. I'll write it again. So, right in the middle would be an understanding of human responsibility coupled with God's sovereignty. So let's see. So complete autonomy would be more where Pelagius was. No, autonomy would be more where Manichaeanism was. Can you see this? No, you can't. Okay. So Augustine is kind of landing in the middle of these two heresies, what he would call heresies, Pelagianism and Manichaeanism. So Augustine's position is that he maintains that humans have moral responsibility, that whenever I commit a crime or sin, that it is my fault. I did it. I chose to do it. But at the same time, he is maintaining God's sovereignty and that God is sovereign over whatever thing I did. So, in this way, you avoid the problem of having to say that God does not have ultimate control. Because once you say that, you're denying God's omnipotence, his all-powerfulness, or his all-knowingness, omniscience. Those are two things that the Christian would not want to do. So, while this can sound like a contradiction to a lot of people, this is the spot that most of the church has landed for centuries upon centuries. So, back in church history, back in like the 300s of Augustine's time and way after, you have a bunch of councils and people getting together, Christians, talking about what is true and what is not true. So if there is a pervasive doctrine that's new, that isn't what Christianity has believed since its inception, then it gets brought before a council, and they determine whether it is heresy or whether it's not. So heresy would be contrary to Orthodox doctrine. So Pelagianism was condemned as heresy because it denied God's ultimate sovereignty. So God's sovereignty, meaning God is sovereign, God has control, God has all power. All those things are kind of the same. Pelagianism denies that. The point in them denying that is so that evil in the world can be explained. Because if God doesn't have ultimate control, then it makes sense why things are so bad on earth. And you don't have to explain the origin of evil, you just say it's humans. It wasn't God. So that's a way of answering the question of where did evil originate. But it seems to put you in a position far worse than you were before, because you end up saying God is not sovereign. God cannot do something. God does not have control over something. But you do not want to go too far to the other side, because then you say that every action I commit is like, I'm only opening this cap because I'm just a puppet. God moved the strings. Now I'm putting it back on because God is controlling that too. So if I go murder someone, you are almost tied to say that God did that because God is controlling every single motion that I take. Okay, so you don't want to be on either of those sides, right? So Augustine wants to land in the middle. He wants to maintain what Scripture says about God, that God is sovereign, and that humans have responsibility. So the way he does this is he has to explain the bondage of the will. So after Adam, this is similar to Eleanor Stump, if you remember. After Adam, and he ends up separating from Eleanor Stump in at some point, but this particular part is reminiscent of Stump. So Adam falls, right? Adam and Eve, they eat the fruit that they were not supposed to eat. So after Adam, all humans are born with a will that is bent towards evil. So for Augustine, this would be called total depravity or original sin. So after Adam, every human, because Adam and Eve's sin was cosmic, it was cosmic rebellion against the only holy God. Because of that, every human afterwards was born with a will that was, in Stump's language, defective, in Augustine's language, sinful. So when you come out of the womb, according to Augustine, or I hate to say most of Christianity, but historically most Christianity, you have a sinful nature. So as a child, everything you do is probably out of selfish ambition. And that's one of the best arguments for children, are one of the best arguments for people who believe in total depravity or original sin, because of how selfish they are. Like first words, mine, or no, or rebellion in any sense. So for Stump as well as Augustine, in order to not have that will anymore, you must be saved. So for Stump, that means that you make the decision to follow God. For Augustine, it's a little more complicated. Because if you are truly born with a sinful nature, it means that everything you choose is chosen out of evil ambition, selfish ambition, whatever it may be. So, you would never be able to make the choice, oh, I want to follow God, because your will is inherently sinful and depraved. So you would never come to a good conclusion, the only good conclusion in this case, that you should follow God. So, this is what the Pelagians do not like about Augustine. Augustine would say that you are not going to be the one that makes that choice, because you can't, because your will is inherently sinful. It chooses only evil. So God must allow you to make that choice. The way he does that is by granting you faith. So for Augustine, out of Romans, in the Bible, it is by grace through faith that you are saved. So the grace of God comes in and allows you to have faith. Okay, so why is that controversial? Why would the Pelagians not like that? Well, it shows that God is choosing who he would have to follow him. So it's whenever it comes to salvation in particular doesn't have the same sort of free will that we might think of. While each decision you make, like whether I pick up this pen and open the cap, that type of thing, I'm making those choices, right? Those are our basic choices. When it comes to salvation, it's of a different caliber, and I don't have the capacity to choose salvation unless God gives me the grace to have faith in him. So a lot of people don't want to say that, because then you have to say that God ultimately makes that choice, that you don't. So it may seem, some people want to construe Augustine as saying you don't have any autonomy because in salvation you don't have free will. But if we look closely, we see that that's actually not what he's saying. It's just that in particular with salvation, we don't have the capacity to choose well. After humans are saved, then they still have a fallen nature because they're still in a fallen world. But now they have the ability to choose good, to choose things that God loves. So, after salvation, you have more of a free will. Before salvation, you have a free will in the sense that you make your everyday decisions, but your will is tied and in bondage to sin. You will always choose what is sinful. Now, what particular sin you choose at any given moment is free, but you're in bondage to sin. Okay, that was a lot. Sorry. So, the main thing to take away. So, I mean, that's a lot of history and theology, but the main thing to take away about Augustine's view of free will is that, and I already wrote this, but I'll write it again, this is the most important thing. Human responsibility and God's sovereignty. You cannot have one without the other, even though they seem like a contradiction. It seems that if God had ultimate control, then we would have no control on the surface. And it seems that if we had ultimate control, that God would not have control. That we would be able to override God's power, and in that sense, we would be greater than the Creator. So that doesn't make sense either. So, this is his conclusion. And people like John Calvin and Martin Luther of the Reformation, this is their position. They take this and they run with it. So if you've ever heard of John Calvin or Calvinism, it's probably more accurately called Augustinianism, because that's not where he's getting it from. They're both reading the same Bible, but Augustine was the first theologian philosopher to really articulate it. All right, let me see if I'm missing anything. Yeah, so he explains that there's these new Pelagian heretics that maintain that their choice of the will is so free that they leave no place for God's grace. So, God's grace is essential to Augustine's position because God's grace is what allows us to have a free will in general. To ever get a free will, you have to have the grace of God. So the Pelagians make it so much of a human decision that they don't leave room for God's grace. So if you grew up in church at all, or are familiar with altar calls, and the amount of pastors who would, say a maybe semi-manipulative message and then try to get people to come and be like, come on, accept Jesus, just say yes, or just say, I accept Jesus into my heart, and then you're saved forever. Someone like Augustine would not love that. Not that you can't say that you make a decision, because in some sense you do. God allows you the grace to make that decision, and then you make it. So there is an order, but there is a decision in some sense. I hope you can't hear my husband. He's being very loud. But anyways, so then he makes the claim. He says, the will is indeed that by which we sin and that by which we live rightly. So before salvation, the will is that by which you sin. After salvation, the will is that by which you live rightly. Then he says, therefore, unless the will itself is set free by God's grace from the servitude in which it was made the slave of sin and is helped to overcome its vices, mortals cannot live rightly and religiously. And unless this divine kindness by which the evil is set free came first, grace would then be given in accordance with deserts, and it would not be grace, which is of course given gratuitously. So, like I said, Augustine had major works talking about the will, but mostly he focused on the free choice of the will because he was writing against the Manichaeans who did not believe in that. But I chose this to give a more full explanation of where he lands in the middle, because in this part he's clarifying, yes, we have a free will, but we don't have ultimate free will. We don't have complete autonomy. God still is sovereign. He still has control. So it's like a divine paradox. Anyways, that's pretty much it. But I wanted to touch on this because of what we've talked about so far whenever we talked about the philosophy of religion and the problem of evil, because I think this gives a bit more insight into how people handle the problem of evil, because Augustine does say that human will is the origin of evil. God is not. But he is still maintaining that God is ultimately sovereign and could have said otherwise in almost every case. Maybe I shouldn't go that far. But God is in ultimate control, and he allows everything that comes to pass. He is sovereign over it. So that is one way to construe an explanation of the problem of evil while maintaining free will and maintaining God's sovereignty. Because you can poke a hole in Eleanor Stump's position just by saying, how does the sovereignty of God fit in this? Because she doesn't explain it. So this would be one way that you could, or you could just deny all of it altogether. So yeah, that was pretty much it. But I hope that is helpful. And for next lecture, we'll be talking about, oh my gosh, I forgot his name. I'm so humiliated. Wow, you know what his name is because you read. So anyways, it's about determinism. So we'll be talking about determinism because this is Augustine's a unique case where it's not really determinism or indeterminism. He's not saying that everything has been set in place. I mean, he is, but it's just an in-between, kind of. So we'll be talking about a harder determinism. So, yeah. Anyways, hope y'all are having a good week. Enjoy everything and have fun.